The Screaming Staircase, Chapter 13. Early that afternoon, we took the short walk to Baker Street Underground Station. It was good to be outdoors again and in pleasant sunlight too. Each of us felt the change. Our mood had lifted. We put on casual clothes. Lockwood wore a long brown leather coat that emphasized his slimness and easy stride. George wore a hideous puffy jacket with a high elastic waistband that emphasized his bottom. I had on my usual gear: coat, roll-neck sweater, short dark skirt, and leggings. All of us wore our rapiers, in my case a spare one from the hall. These, and the cuts and bruises on our faces, were the marks of our profession and our status. People moved aside for us as we went by. The Jubilee line train was crowded and heavy with the sweet protective smell of lavender. Men wore sprigs of it in their buttonholes. Women had them in their hats. All across the carriage, silver brooches and tie pins winked and glittered beneath the neon lights. We stood silent and serious as the train rattled through the tunnels on the 5-minute journey to Green Park. No one spoke. The eyes of the crowd followed us as we alighted and set off along the platform. During the trip, George had been flicking through the Latin dictionary. As we went up the escalator, he took his pencil out of his mouth and made a last notation on a scrap of paper. "Okay," he said. "I've done the best that I can. It's tormentum meum latitia me, right? Well, tormentum means torment or torture. Latitia equals joy or bliss. Meum and me are both my. So I translate this inscription in our locket as my torment, my bliss." He snapped the dictionary shut. "Not the healthiest of love messages, is it?" "Fits exactly what I had sensed," I said shortly. It wasn't a healthy relationship. It veered between extremes. Half the time it was sort of happy, half the time eaten up by jealousy and hate, and that's what triumphed in the end. "Don't think about it anymore, Lucy," Lockwood said. "You've done your part. Now, George and I will do ours." "How long do you think it'll take us at the archives, George?" "Not long," George said. "We'll go back to the local newspaper, starting at the date where I left off. If there's any more about Annabelle Ward, whether they ever arrested anyone, for instance, we should find it straight away. Then we can check the gossip magazines, too. It said she was a society girl." We left the train station and started up Piccadilly. Afternoon light lanced steeply between tall buildings. We walked from bright sun to blue shadow and back again. It being late autumn, preparations for evening were already underway. A salt spreader pushed his cart along the roadside, scattering fresh grains left and right like snow. Outside the big hotels, attendants filled trash cans with bunches of dried lavender ready for burning. Others polished the ghost lamps hanging above the doors. I let my bruised muscles stretch out as I walked. It was nice to feel my strength returning. Lockwood was limping slightly, but otherwise full of zest. He'd moved the bandages from his ghost-touched arm to let the sunshine bathe his skin. "If we can solve this old case," he said, "if we can uncover the murder and get justice for the girl, it'll be brilliant publicity. It'll totally offset the fact we burned the woman's house down. And help us save Lockwood and Company. In the bargain," I said. "That's the hope." He steered past a man offering tourist maps of the safe zones of the city and ignored the entries of an iron cellar, but only if we get good cases and get them soon. "You realize DPRAC will be working on this also," George pointed out. "It's never their priority, but they do investigate old murders if they happened within living memory." "All the more reason to act fast," Lockwood said. "Okay, let's cross here." We ducked out across the street, stepping over the open drain or runnel of running water that separated the sidewalk from the asphalt. The wandering dead were known to dislike moving water. Consequently, narrow runnels crisscrossed many of the great shopping streets in the West End, allowing people to walk in safety well into the evening. Earlier governments had hoped to extend this system across the city, but it had proved prohibitively expensive. Aside from ghost lamps, the suburbs fended for themselves. Up a side road, under a great stone arch, out onto the sweeping curve of Regent Street. Not far ahead, a stand had been set up on the sidewalk. Flags fluttered across above a cherry blood red canopy. On each flag reared a gold heraldic lion and an ornament letter R. "Oh, look," George said. "Hot chestnuts. Who wants them?" A group of boys and girls in dark red jackets were arranged around the stand, giving out free sprigs of lavender, salt bombs, and sweets to passerbys. Roasting chestnuts popped and crackled on an open grill. An ached youth with a giant scoop stood by to tip them into paper cones. The agents' hair was carefully brushed, their swords polished, their faces scrubbed and smiling. All seemed to have been pressed out of the same anemic mold. They were representatives of Rotwell's, the second oldest psychic investigation agency in London, and thanks to its publicity campaigns, the most popular by wide margin. Behind the stand, set back a little from the street, the central Rotwell office rose, a vast, smooth-fronted edifice of glass and marble. Snarling lions holding rapiers in their forepaws had been inscribed into the glass of its sliding double doors. I knew the interior of that office. I'd failed an interview there. A smiling boy, no more than 10 years old, held out a little cone of chestnuts as we approached. "Gift courtesy of Rotwell's," he said. "Go safe tonight." "We're not having any," Lockwood growled. "George, I want you just to walk on by." "But I'm hungry." "Tough. You're not walking down the street with one of those cones in your hand. It would be a crime to advertise a competitor." He ignored the boy and stalked on past. George hesitated, then took the cone and popped it into his pocket. "There," he said, nicely out of sight. "I say it's a crime to refuse free food." We pushed on through the pressing crowd and came out on the other side. A few minutes later, we had reached a quiet, leafy square a block behind Regent Street. It was dominated by an ugly, brick-fronted building of a colossal size. An iron plaque on the door read, "National Newspaper Archives." George's spectacles gleamed. This was his territory. He had the nearest I'd seen to a smile on his chestnut-stained face. "Here we go. Keep your voices down. The librarians are picky here." He ushered us over the iron line and through the revolving doors. I'd never been a big one for reading as a kid. My family rarely had a book in the house, and I'd been apprenticed out to Jacobs almost before starting school. Of course, I had needed to read in order to complete my studies. You can't get any of your certificates without a simple written exam, and I'd memorized the Fitz Manual for ghost hunters by the time I was 12. But after that, to be honest, I was too busy working to spend much time with books. True, Jacobs had occasionally sent me to the local library to pick up his historical details on hangings, the region around Gibbet Hill, half a mile from our little town, being a notorious spot for visitors, so I wasn't entirely unused to buildings full of printed paper. But the National Newspaper Archives was on a bigger scale than anything I'd seen before. The complex had 6 enormous floors, piled about a central concrete atrium. When you stood at the bottom, among the palms and indoor trees, the ascending levels of shelves and racks and reading tables seemed to reach the sky. A large iron sculpture hung from the domed roof high above, part decoration, part defense. On every level, hunched figures flipped through yellowed newspapers and magazines. Some, perhaps, researched the problem, looking for clues to the plague that beset us. Others were agents. I saw blue Tamworth jackets dotted about, the lilac tones of Grimble, and here and there the somber, dark gray hues of Fitz. Not for the first time, I wondered why Lockwood hadn't chosen to clothe us in coordinated uniform of her own. Like me, Lockwood seemed somewhat overawed, but George bustled us along in a confident manner. Within a few minutes, he had taken us by elevator to the 4th floor, sat us down at an empty desk, and after disappearing for a moment, plunked down the first great gray files before us. Here are the local papers from the Richmond district, 49 years ago, he said. Annabelle Ward disappeared in late June. The article I found came out a week or so later. Lockwood, why don't you start with the July editions? They're the most likely to be helpful. Lucy, you check the autumn file. I'll go get some issues of London Society. Lockwood and I took off our coats and immersed ourselves obediently in the thrill-a-minute pages of the Richmond Examiner. I soon found it contained more local parties, lost cats, and best-kept garden competitions than I could have believed existed in the universe. There was quite a bit about the problem, too, the nature of which was beginning to be discussed. I found early calls for ghost lights to be erected, they eventually were, and for graveyards to be bulldozed and salt down. They weren't. It was far too expensive and controversial. Instead, they were simply ringed with iron. But I discovered nothing more about the hunt for the missing girl. Lockwood and George, who was flipping through the glossy black and white photos of the society magazines, were having a similar lack of luck. Lockwood grew restless, and he looked sighingly at his watch. Shadows fell over my page. Looking up, I discovered 3 people standing by the table, watching us with ill-concealed amusement. 2 were teenagers, a boy and a girl. The other was a very young man. All 3 wore the soft gray jackets and crisp black pants of the oldest, most prestigious company of ghost hunters in London, the Old Grey Lady of the Strand, the celebrated Fitz Agency. Their rapiers had complex Italian-style hilts, much more old-fashioned and expensive than ours. They carried neat gray briefcases emblazed like their jackets with the Fitz symbol, the rearing silver unicorn. Lockwood and George got to their feet. The young man smiled at them. "Hello, Tony," he said. "This is novel. Haven't seen you here before." Tony. No one in the 6 long months I'd known him had so much as dared to call him Anthony. For a split second, I assumed there was a great friendship between this Fitz supervisor and Lockwood. Then I realized it was the other thing. Lockwood was smiling too, but not in a way I'd ever seen before. It was somehow wolf-like. Deep creases hid his eyes. "Quill Kipps," he said. "How's life treating you?" "Busy, very busy. What about you, Tony? You look rough, if you don't mind me saying." "Oh, it's nothing serious. Just a few knocks. Can't complain." "Yes, I imagine you haven't got time for that," the young man said. "What with all the other people complaining about you?" He was very slightly built, almost bird-like, his delicacy of a form. He probably weighed less than I did. He had a small, rather upturned nose, a narrow, freckled face, and auburn hair cropped severely short. He had 4 or 5 medals pinned to his breast of his jacket, and in the pommel of his rapier was a glittering green stone. Not that he could use the sword much these days. I guessed he was about 20, so his days of active service were behind him. His talent had mostly shriveled up and gone. Like my older leader, Jacobs, and all the other useless supervisors choking the industry, all he could do now was boss the kids around. Lockwood didn't seem overly perturbed by the jibe. "Well, you know," he said, "these things happen. So, what are you researching? Clusters of ghosts in a road tunnel near Moorgate, trying to figure out what they are. He eyed our open files. I see you're looking into something too? Yes. Richmond Examiner. Oh, I see. The notorious Sheen Road case. Of course, here at Fitz, we tend to do our research before we take on a visitor. We're not completely stupid, you know? The boy at his side, a tall, gangling youth with large, big-boned head and a thatch of mousy hair, laughed dutifully. The girl didn't respond. Humor, even the snide and easy sort that she was meant to side with, didn't seem to be her thing. Her chin was small and slightly pointy. Her blonde hair had been cut short at the back, but she had a sharp flicked angled across her forehead. Its tip almost reached her eye. I thought her striking, in a hard and plastic sort of way. She gazed at me. Who's this? New assistant, Lockwood said. Well, new-ish. I held up a hand to the girl. Lucy Carlyle. And you? Are? The girl gave a little laugh and looked away up the aisles as if there was a chip bag or something lying there that she found more interesting than me. You ought to watch out being with Tony, sweetheart, Quill Kipps said. His last assistant came to a nasty end. I smiled blandly. Don't worry about me, I'm fine. Yeah, but bad things happen to people he's close to. It's always been that way, since he was ever so young. He tried to make it sound casual, but his tone betrayed him. There was a catch in his voice that I didn't understand. I glanced across at Lockwood. The way he stood was different. His studious unconcern had stiffened, become something harder and less pliable. I knew he was about to say something, but before he could speak, George stirred. I have been hearing things about you too, Quill, he said. That young lad you sent into Southwark catacombs alone while you waited for reinforcements at the door. What became of that kid, Quill? Or haven't they found him yet? Kipps frowned. Who told you that? That wasn't the way it happened. And that client who got ghost touched because your agents left an arm bone in his trash can? The man flushed. That was a mistake. They threw away the wrong bag. Plus, you have the highest mortality rate of any Fitz team leader, so I'm told. Well, it's not a great record, is it? There was a silence. Oh, and your fly's undone, George said. Kipps looked down and discovered the unhappy truth of the statement. His face went bright red. His fingers strayed to his sword hilt. He took a half step forward. George didn't move, but unblinkably pointed a quiet sign hanging on the wall. Quill Kipps took a deep breath. He smoothed his hair back, smiled. Pity I can't close that fat mouth of yours, Cubbins, he said. But there'll come a time when I will. Okay, George said. Meanwhile, why not pick a fight with someone your own size, huh? I suggest a gerbil or a mole. Kipps made a small sound with his lips. He moved. The blade was in his hand. A blur of moment at my side, a tang of steel on steel. Lockwood scarcely seemed to have changed position, but the line of his rapier now stretched out diagonally across the table, intersecting Kipps's blade, pressing it firmly down. If you're going to mess about with swords, Quill, Lockwood said, you'd better be able to use them. Kipps said nothing. A vein pulsed halfway up his neck. Under the smart material of his soft gray sleeve, his arm exerted pressure. I could see that he was trying to shift his rapier, first one way, then the other, but Lockwood, without appearing to expend any effort whatsoever, forestalled him. The blades remained there, their owners almost motionless. George and I, and the two Fitz agents, were likewise frozen, as if by some magical extension. All around us, the library's quiet hum went on. You can't keep this up forever, Kipps said. True. Lockwood's arms twisted. He flicked his wrist. Kipps' rapier was snatched from his hand. It flew straight up and embedded itself point first in the ceiling. Nice, I said. Smiling, Lockwood returned his sword to his belt and sat back down, leaving Kipps breathing loudly through his nose. After a moment, he gave a little jump, hoping to reach the hilt of his hanging sword, but missed by several inches. He jumped again. A little bit higher, Quill, George said encouragingly. You almost got it then. At length, Kipps had to scramble onto the table in order to wrestle his rapier free. His agents watched in silence, the boy smirking, the blonde girl as stony-faced as ever. You'll pay for that, Lockwood, Kipps said, when he returned to the ground. I swear I'll make you pay. Everyone knows Deeprak's going to close you down, but that won't be enough for me. I'll find a way of making you really suffer. You and these idiot friends of yours. Bill, Kate, come on. He spun around. His lackeys did too. Like a small, poorly trained dance ensemble, they flounced away in unison toward the elevator. Even when I worked with him, Kipps had a terribly short fuse, George observed. He's got to learn to lighten up a bit. Wouldn't you say so, Lockwood? But Lockwood was already buried in the files again, his lips a hard, thin line. Come on, he said. We've got a job to do here. We mustn't waste more time. In fact, it was only another minute or so before the breakthrough came, and it was Lockwood himself who made it. With a low, long whistle of triumph, he pointed to the newspaper before him. There she was, Annabelle Ward. A different photograph, same familiar splash of blonde hair, curves, and gleaming teeth. This time, she was wearing some kind of a ball gown. This time, she'd made the front cover of Richmond Examiner 49 years ago. Annie Ward, ex-boyfriend, questioned. The case of Annie Ward, the local woman missing for almost 2 weeks, took a new turn last night when police arrested one of her former boyfriends, Mr. Hugo Blake, 22, a well-known gambler and society figure, is currently being held at Bow Street Police Station. He has not yet been formally charged. According to police sources, Mr. Blake was one of Miss Ward's dining companions at the Gallops nightclub on Saturday, 21st of June, the night she disappeared. He is said to have left the club soon after Miss Ward, and under repeated questioning, he admitted driving her home. Sources say that the pair had been close some months previously, but that their relationship had cooled. Blake's association with Miss Ward caused much comment in fashionable circles. Under his influence, she had largely abandoned a promising acting career, though she had recently made attempts to find new roles in Hugo Blake, I said softly. Her former boyfriend. I bet he gave her that necklace. George nodded. And he took her home that night. Well, I think we know what he did there. Keep looking, Lockwood said. They arrested him, but he wasn't charged? For all we know, he may have gone to prison, even though they didn't locate the body. It didn't take long to find the answer. A small piece dated a few days later tersely recorded that Hugo Blake had been released without charge. Scotland Yard sources were quoted saying the Annabelle Ward inquiry had run up against a brick wall. A brick wall is right, I gasped. Those idiots, she was right there all along. They didn't have enough evidence to nail Blake at that time, Lockwood said, scanning the page. He was the only real suspect in the case, but they couldn't back it up. He claimed he'd escorted her home and left her there, but hadn't gone inside. No one could prove otherwise, and since they didn't have the body or anything else to go on, they couldn't press charges. So they let him walk. This is perfect. Looks like Blake's our man. George sat back in his chair. How old was Blake then? 22, I said. Poor Annie Ward was only 20. Well, That was 49 years ago, long time, but he'd only be 71 now. He's probably still alive. I bet he is, I said savagely. I bet he's living it up ever since he got away with murder. Until now, Lockwood said. He grinned at us. This is just what we needed, as long as we treat it right. So here's the plan. We contact DPRAC. If Blake's still living, he'll be arrested. Meanwhile, we go to the papers, tell them the story. Killer caught after 50 years. That should make some waves. That's fine, George said slowly, but I'm not sure we should go public yet. There's a lot more research we could do, checking into Annie Ward's past. He patted the pile of London Society magazines beside him. She's bound to be here somewhere, and if we're lucky, we can probably find juicy stuff on Blake too, which might. You carry on, Lockwood scraped his chair back, got to his feet. Let me know what you find. Meantime, I'm going to talk to some people. We lost 3 clients this morning. For the sake of the agency, we can't afford to hang around. Well, George adjusted his glasses doubtfully. Don't be too hasty, that's all. Lockwood gave us both a gleaming smile. Oh, I'll be careful. You know me.